Have you ever learned the truth because a lie was careless? The envelope looked ordinary, the kind that arrives when you've forgotten to update a mailing list. Thin. Cream-colored. My name printed with a precision that suggested a machine knew more about me than any person ever had. I almost tossed it onto the hall table with the grocery flyers and charity appeals. Almost. Something about the weight of it made me pause. Not heavy in ounces, but heavy in implication, like a thought that refuses to be dismissed. I slid it open, standing up. I didn't sit because I didn't expect to stay long with it. That's how surprises work. They don't ask for permission. They don't offer chairs. The statement inside was crisp and clinical, columns and decimals marching in neat lines. At first, my eyes skimmed the headings without comprehension. Account summary. Dividend history. Unclaimed funds. My name again, typed this time, not printed. Then the number caught me. Not because it was loud, but because it was wrong. So wrong it felt obscene. $280,417.63. Unclaimed dividends. I read it again. And again. I checked the date, the account identifier, the fine print. I told myself it had to be a mistake, the kind that resolves itself when you blink hard enough. But the numbers didn't move. They stayed exactly where they were, like they had been waiting for me. I sat down. The house was quiet in the way only a late afternoon can be quiet, when the day has given up on ambition and is just counting down. I could hear the refrigerator hum. A car passed somewhere beyond the trees. Life continued at its usual speed while my understanding of it cracked open. The statement listed a series of payouts stretching back years. Years. Each marked, unclaimed. Each addressed to an account that, according to my aunt, had been closed long ago. Closed cleanly. Closed responsibly. Closed because she said it was the right thing to do. I could hear her voice as clearly as if she was standing in my kitchen, arms folded, chin lifted just enough to suggest authority. I took care of everything, she'd said. There's nothing left to worry about. She'd said it kindly, even generously, as though she were relieving me of a burden I wasn't equipped to carry. I remembered thanking her. That memory stung more than the number. My hands were steady as I turned the page. That surprised me. I expected shaking, or heat, or the cinematic rush people talk about when truth arrives. Instead, there was a calm so deep it felt rehearsed, like my body had been preparing for this moment long before my mind caught up. At the bottom of the statement was a customer service number and a line that read, "If you believe this account belongs to you, please contact us to begin the verification process." Belongs to you. The phrase echoed. Ownership isn't just legal. It's moral. It asks who knew, who decided, who benefited. It asks who stayed silent. I thought back over the last few years. The careful conversations, the assurances, the subtle discouragement whenever I asked questions that drifted too close to the truth. I thought about the way my aunt's eyes hardened just a fraction whenever finances came up. How quickly she changed the subject. How often she reminded me that she was handling it. Handling it. I folded the statement slowly and slid it back into the envelope, as if it might run away if I didn't contain it. My reflection in the window looked older than it had that morning, not because of fear, but because of clarity. Clarity ages you. It strips away the luxury of confusion. I didn't call the number yet. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even cry. I did one thing instead. I pulled out a notebook I hadn't used in years and wrote the date at the top of the page. Then I wrote a single sentence beneath it, careful and deliberate, like a vow I intended to keep. If this money exists, then so does the truth, and I'm going to find out who buried it. I closed the notebook just as the phone buzzed on the counter. A message lit up the screen. Her name. My aunt's name. And in that moment, before I even read what she had written, I knew the statement wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the proof that the ending she promised me had been a lie all along. Before I tell you what I did next, you need to understand who I am. Not the version people assume, but the woman who exists quietly beneath their expectations. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 62 years old, recently retired, and I've spent most of my life being described with words like reliable, practical, and uncomplicated. I was the one people handed folders to when things needed organizing, the one entrusted with spare keys, the one called when calm was required. I never mistook those traits for power, but I understood their value. People tell you more when they believe you won't make noise with it. I was married once, long enough to learn the shape of compromise and short enough to escape before it hollowed me out. No children. No appetite for drama. I worked for 3 decades as a compliance officer for a regional firm, the kind of job that teaches you how lies behave under pressure. They sweat. They repeat themselves. They rely on authority rather than evidence. I learned early that truth doesn't need volume. It needs documentation. When my mother died, I grieved her in a clean, contained way. She had been practical too, a woman who kept receipts and labeled envelopes. My aunt, her younger sister, stepped in quickly, efficiently. She insisted on helping me navigate the details. She had always been like that. Confident. Decisive. The kind of woman who never asked if she could take control, only when. At the time, I was tired. Grief has a way of convincing you that surrender is the same thing as trust. So when my aunt said she'd close accounts, consolidate assets, handle the administrative mess so I could heal, I let her. I signed where she pointed. I nodded when she spoke. I didn't ask for copies of everything, because she told me there was no need. There's nothing left, she'd said months later, her hand resting lightly on mine across the kitchen table. I made sure of it. I believed her because belief was easier than suspicion. Because she was family. Because I had no reason not to. Or so I told myself. The truth is, I've always known how money disappears. I've seen it vanish in small ways. Fees buried in footnotes, balances shifted just far enough to avoid notice, authority used as camouflage. I used to teach junior staff that fraud rarely announces itself. It whispers. It waits for you to be polite. That night, after the statement arrived, I stood in my bedroom and looked at the woman in the mirror. She looked composed. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back. Her eyes were steady. But beneath that surface, something had changed. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something awake. I read my aunt's message then. It was short. Casual. Just checking in. Hope you're doing well. Let me know if you need anything. I stared at it longer than necessary, letting the timing settle. People who lie often sense when the ground beneath them shifts. They reach out not to connect, but to check the temperature. To see if the silence has teeth. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my old filing cabinet, the one I'd kept from my working years, and began pulling out folders I hadn't touched since retirement. Blank notebooks. A calculator that still worked. A pen I trusted. These were familiar tools. Comforting. Honest. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for alignment. If an account existed in my name, then a trail existed too. And if a trail existed, it meant someone had made decisions on my behalf without my consent. That wasn't just a financial question. It was a moral one. I went to bed that night without calling the number on the statement. Without confronting my aunt. Without telling a soul. But sleep didn't come easily. Because somewhere between midnight and morning, I realized something that tightened my chest in a way grief never had. If my aunt lied once, deliberately and cleanly, then this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. It was a system waiting to be exposed. And I was no longer the woman who would look away. Families don't fracture all at once. They thin. They stretch. They learn how to avoid certain rooms of conversation the way old houses teach you where the floorboards creak. By the time something finally gives way, everyone claims surprise, even though the warning signs were always there. My aunt, Eleanor, had always been the loudest presence in any room. Not rude, never that, but authoritative, like a voice that expected to be followed rather than questioned. Growing up, I watched her make decisions for everyone with an ease that suggested destiny rather than preference. Restaurants, holidays, even opinions. If Eleanor spoke first, the rest of us adjusted accordingly. My mother used to say Eleanor was good in a crisis. And she was. When my father died young, Eleanor organized the funeral before the shock had worn off. When my mother fell ill years later, Eleanor rearranged schedules, spoke to doctors, managed logistics with brisk efficiency. She thrived in moments when others froze. People mistook that competence for selflessness. But competence, I learned long ago, is morally neutral. It only tells you what someone can do, not why they do it. There were other relatives, of course. Cousins scattered across states, a brother-in-law who drifted in and out of relevance, holiday-only connections bound by tradition more than affection. Eleanor sat at the center of it all like a spoke hub, controlling information simply by being the one who answered questions first. After my mother's death, family conversations narrowed. Eleanor became the gatekeeper of updates. "Everything's handled," she'd say. "There's nothing for you to worry about." When cousins asked about the estate, she waved it off. "Margaret's fine." I made sure of that. I remember feeling oddly invisible during those months. Protected, perhaps, but also edited out of my own story. Decisions were discussed about me, not with me. When I spoke up, Eleanor would smile reassuring and say, "Trust me. You don't need to carry this." And because grief makes you doubt your footing, I did. Looking back, the imbalance was subtle but consistent. Eleanor held the documents. Eleanor spoke to the advisors. Eleanor decided when matters were settled. No one challenged her because no one wanted to appear ungrateful. Family dynamics are excellent at teaching people to confuse politeness with virtue. There was also history between us, unspoken but influential. Eleanor had always seen me as capable, but not ambitious. Reliable, but not assertive. I was the niece who followed rules, who did well in quiet ways. She, on the other hand, had fought loudly for everything she had. She respected strength, but only when it looked like hers. At family gatherings after the estate was resolved, Eleanor watched me carefully. Not suspiciously. Appraisingly. As if checking that I was still the version of myself she understood. When I mentioned downsizing my home or delaying travel plans, she nodded with something like approval. "You've always been sensible," she'd say. "Your mother would be proud." I believed her meant it. The rest of the family took their cues from her. If Eleanor said things were done, they were done. If Eleanor said I was taken care of, I must be. Silence settled over the subject like dust. Comfortable. Neglected. That's how family myths survive, through repetition and relief. Through the desire to believe that someone else has already handled the difficult parts. But the statement in my hands had punctured that myth cleanly. It suggested a parallel reality, one where money hadn't vanished, just waited. Where decisions had been made in private and justified in public with confidence instead of proof. As dawn crept into the windows the morning after I received it, I realized something unsettling. Eleanor hadn't just stepped in during a vulnerable moment. She'd positioned herself there. And whatever she'd done with that position wasn't an accident. It was a continuation of a family pattern that had gone unchallenged for decades. The question wasn't whether the family would be shocked by the truth. It was whether they would recognize it at all when it finally surfaced. Betrayal rarely announces itself with cruelty. More often, it arrives wearing the softest language available. The language of help. I didn't confront Eleanor right away. Instead, I did what grief and age have taught me to do best. I reviewed facts quietly. The morning after the statement arrived, I called the number at the bottom of the page. My voice was calm, practiced. The same voice I'd used for decades when asking questions that mattered. The woman on the line confirmed the account was real. Active. Registered in my name since before my mother's death. The dividends had accrued automatically, reinvested, untouched. When I asked why the funds were unclaimed, there was a pause. "We've sent notices," she said carefully. But all correspondence was redirected per the instructions on file. Redirected? I asked where. She read the address aloud. Eleanor's address. I thanked her and ended the call without another word. I sat very still afterward, letting the shape of the betrayal settle into something I could examine without distortion. This wasn't theft in the dramatic sense. No empty vaults. No forged signatures that would make a courtroom gasp. It was something quieter and far more intimate. Eleanor had positioned herself as steward, then quietly diverted information so only she could see the full picture. She didn't take the money outright. She simply made sure I never knew it existed. That distinction mattered. It told me how she thought. How careful she'd been. I requested copies of the account history, every change of address, every instruction filed. The packet arrived 2 days later, thick and meticulous. Eleanor's handwriting appeared in scanned forms, steady and unmistakable. Temporary, she'd written beside the redirection request. Renewed annually. 4 years. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one is watching. As I read, memory rearranged itself. The times Eleanor insisted on handling mail. The way she'd casually ask if I'd received anything important lately. The gentle discouragement whenever I mentioned meeting with an advisor of my own. Why complicate things, she'd say. It's all settled. What she meant was, I have settled it. I wasn't angry yet. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt instead was a precise sadness, the kind that comes from understanding someone completely and wishing you didn't. Eleanor hadn't acted out of desperation. She was comfortable. Secure. This wasn't survival. It was control. The belief that she knew best, that outcomes justified methods, that silence was a kindness if it kept order intact. But there was another layer to the betrayal, one that cut deeper than the money. In her letters to the firm, Eleanor referred to herself as acting in Margaret's best interest. She'd signed forms as a concerned relative, as someone easing a burden I supposedly couldn't manage. She'd built a narrative in which I was passive, fragile, grateful. She had rewritten me. I realized then that the lie wasn't just about finances. It was about identity. About who was allowed to know, decide, and speak. She'd taken advantage of my trust not because I was weak, but because she believed I would remain quiet. By the time I finished reviewing the documents, night had fallen again. I closed the folder and set it beside my notebook, where I'd begun logging dates and details. The pattern was undeniable. Deliberate. Sustained. This was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over with a conversation. It was a choice she'd made repeatedly, confident that I would never look closely enough to see it. I picked up my phone then and typed a message, my fingers steady. We need to talk. About the accounts you said were closed. I didn't send it. Because once you confront a lie like this, you don't get to choose the pace anymore. The truth moves faster once it's acknowledged. And I wasn't ready to give Eleanor that advantage. Instead, I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. The betrayal was clear now. What remained uncertain was how far Eleanor had been willing to go to keep it hidden, and what she would do when she realized I finally knew. There is a particular comfort in evidence. It doesn't argue. It doesn't raise its voice. It simply waits for you to notice what it's been saying all along. Once I understood the shape of Eleanor's deception, I approached the situation the same way I used to approach complex compliance reviews. Methodically, without emotion, and with the assumption that the first answer is never the full one. I began by requesting everything. Not summaries. Not reassurances. Originals. Scans. Logs. I asked the firm for every communication ever sent regarding the account, every recorded call, every change request, every note entered by an employee who thought no one would ever read it again. They complied readily. Institutions tend to be cooperative when you ask precise questions in a calm voice. The file grew quickly. Email headers revealed forwarding rules. Mailing records showed consistent redirection to Eleanor's address, renewed just before expiration each year. The pattern wasn't reactive, it was maintained. Someone had set calendar reminders. Someone had remembered to renew silence. I cross-referenced the dates with my own records. Family visits. Holidays. Casual lunches where Eleanor had assured me everything was handled. The alignment was unsettling. Each renewal coincided with a moment of proximity, a moment when trust was refreshed just enough to be exploited again. Then I looked beyond that single account. The statement had arrived because of a clerical error, an automated system flagging dormant funds for regulatory review. That meant oversight was tightening, which meant Eleanor's control depended on remaining unnoticed. People who hide one thing often hide others the same way. I contacted the state's Unclaimed Property Office and searched my name. Another account appeared. Smaller, but still significant. Different institution. Same redirection history. Same handwriting on the authorization forms. That's when I understood this wasn't opportunistic. It was systematic. I created a ledger in my notebook, page after page of dates, amounts, signatures, addresses. I noted not just what Eleanor did, but how she justified it. Temporary. Administrative. For convenience. Euphemisms are the architecture of ethical compromise. I consulted an attorney quietly, not to threaten or accuse, but to understand boundaries. What constituted misrepresentation? What qualified as breach of fiduciary duty, even within family? The answer was measured but clear. Intent matters, patterns matter, and documentation changes everything. I wasn't interested in punishment. I wanted correction, restoration, and acknowledgement. But acknowledgement doesn't come from asking politely. As the days passed, Eleanor grew more present. She called, left messages, stopped by unannounced once, her smile a little too fixed when I didn't answer the door. She sensed movement. Lies are perceptive that way, they feel the air change. I remained silent. Instead, I prepared. I drafted a timeline so clean it could be read aloud without commentary. I organized copies of every form she'd signed. I highlighted her language, her renewals, her choices. I rehearsed nothing aloud, because I didn't need to. The truth, when assembled properly, doesn't require rehearsal. What surprised me most during that week wasn't my anger, but my clarity. I slept well. I ate regularly. I felt, for the first time since my mother's death, fully inside my own life again. The investigation wasn't about proving Eleanor wrong. It was about reclaiming authorship. By the time I closed the final folder, I knew exactly what had happened, how long it had lasted, and how it would read to anyone else. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind. All that remained was the moment of convergence, the point at which Eleanor's private decisions would meet public reality. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. Because the most effective confrontations don't rely on raised voices. They rely on the simple, devastating weight of facts that have nowhere left to go. There comes a moment in every reckoning when action becomes a choice rather than a reaction. I reached mine on a quiet Thursday morning, standing in my kitchen with a cup of tea cooling untouched beside me. Eleanor had left another message the night before. Her tone had shifted, less casual now, more urgent. "We should really talk," she'd said. "I feel like there's been a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. The word was a bridge she hoped I would cross so she wouldn't have to. I didn't intend to cross it. Instead, I decided how the truth would enter the room, and who would be there when it did. Families, I've learned, are excellent at absorbing private harm and terrible at addressing it. If I confronted Eleanor alone, she could frame it as a personal dispute, a lapse in communication, something to be smoothed over and quietly forgotten. Silence would resume its old job. I wasn't interested in silence anymore. So I sent a single email, carefully worded and broadly addressed. Eleanor. 2 cousins who had always deferred to her. And a family friend who had once served as executor for another relative and understood the weight of paperwork. I've discovered several active financial accounts in my name that were redirected without my knowledge. I'd like to review the documentation together and clarify how this occurred. I'll be at my home Saturday at 2 p.m. No accusations. No emotion. Just an invitation to reality. Eleanor replied within minutes. This is unnecessary. We can talk privately. That was confirmation enough. The next 2 days passed slowly. I reviewed my materials again, not because I doubted them, but because repetition sharpens focus. I imagined Eleanor's likely defenses: confusion, benevolence, fatigue. I prepared responses that required no argument, only reference. Saturday arrived clear and cold. I arranged the dining table with care, folders stacked in order, copies for each person, my notebook open to the timeline. This wasn't theater. It was structure. Eleanor arrived last. She looked composed, dressed neatly, her smile practiced. She greeted everyone warmly, kissed my cheek as if nothing had shifted beneath us. But her eyes flicked to the table, to the papers, and I saw something tighten. We sat. I began by thanking everyone for coming. My voice didn't waver. I stated only what I knew to be verifiable: that accounts existed, that dividends had accrued, that correspondence had been redirected. Then I slid the first document across the table. Silence did the rest. Eleanor spoke eventually. I was just helping, she said. You were overwhelmed. I didn't think you wanted to deal with all that. I nodded and turned a page. This redirection was renewed annually for 7 years. She faltered. I must have forgotten to change it back. I turned another page. Here is the reminder email sent to you 3 weeks before each renewal. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. Eleanor tried once more. I never took the money. I know, I said. That's documented too. What she hadn't expected was that I understood the difference between theft and concealment, and that the latter was sometimes harder to defend. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why. I didn't accuse her of malice. I simply finished. When I reached the end of the timeline, I closed the folder and looked at her directly. This ends now. All redirections will be reversed. I'll take control of every account in my name. And this information will be shared with any institution that needs it to ensure it doesn't happen again. Eleanor's face had gone pale. Around us, the others sat stunned, not by drama, but by clarity. The truth had entered the room exactly as I intended. Calm, documented, and impossible to ignore. What followed would change our family forever. But the choice to act had already been made. And it had given me something I hadn't felt in years. My voice, fully returned. Consequences don't always arrive with punishment. Sometimes they arrive with exposure, and the slow, irreversible shift of power that follows. Eleanor didn't argue after that. Not really. She sat back in her chair, hands folded too tightly in her lap, her authority evaporating in real time. For someone who had always governed by certainty, uncertainty was its own sentence. The cousins avoided her eyes. The family friend asked careful questions, not of me, but of the documents. That alone told the story. Authority had transferred without a word being spoken. By Monday, the redirections were reversed. I received confirmation emails directly, each one landing in my inbox like a small correction to the past. The institutions were professional, efficient, quietly apologetic. They didn't dwell on Eleanor's role. They didn't need to. The paper trail spoke for itself. What mattered more was what happened within the family. Eleanor withdrew. She stopped calling. She declined invitations. When she did appear, her voice had lost its edge. People listened to her differently now, not with fear or deference, but with caution. Trust, once fractured, doesn't announce its departure. It simply stops showing up. No one confronted her aggressively. No one needed to. The family adjusted around her absence the way it always had around her presence. Roles reshuffle quickly when certainty is removed. There were practical consequences too. The family friend, without fanfare, informed Eleanor that she would no longer be consulted on financial matters. A cousin quietly took over organizing gatherings. Decisions were discussed openly instead of deferred. Eleanor had built her influence on the assumption that she knew best. Now everyone knew better. As for the money, it was restored carefully, transparently. Dividends transferred. Accounts consolidated under my direct control. I didn't rush it. Restoration deserves the same patience as investigation. Eleanor never apologized. That surprised some people. It didn't surprise me. Apologies require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have meant admitting that her authority had been misplaced. Instead, she framed it as a misunderstanding, a difference in perspective. She spoke of intentions, not outcomes. I didn't correct her. Because consequences don't need agreement. They only need permanence. The most telling moment came weeks later at a small family dinner. Eleanor arrived late, took a seat at the end of the table, and waited. No one asked her opinion before ordering. No one looked to her when a question arose. When she offered a suggestion, it was received politely, and weighed, not accepted by default. She noticed. I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way she paused mid-sentence, recalibrating. Control, once assumed, is hard to relearn as optional. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The justice in this wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about alignment. Authority returned to where it belonged. Information flowed to the person it affected. Silence lost its usefulness. Eleanor still had her life, her home, her routines. What she lost was something she'd valued more than she ever admitted. Unquestioned control. And once that's gone, it doesn't come back. Not loudly, not secretly, not ever. The family had changed. So had I. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because consequences don't end with exposure. They end when understanding finally arrives. Healing doesn't feel the way people expect it to feel. There's no surge of relief. No cinematic release where everything suddenly makes sense. It's quieter than that. More deliberate. Like learning to breathe again after years of holding your breath without realizing it. In the weeks that followed, my life began to reorder itself in small, almost unnoticeable ways. I took full ownership of my finances, not just in paperwork, but in presence. I met with advisors of my choosing. I asked questions I'd once deferred. Each answer restored a little more trust, not in institutions, but in my own judgment. The money mattered, of course. It represented security, autonomy, choices I could now make without apology. But what mattered more was the absence of distortion. For the first time since my mother's death, nothing was being filtered through someone else's interpretation of my needs. The family adjusted, too. Conversations grew more direct. Assumptions were checked instead of accepted. People asked rather than decided. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the foundation of any real peace. Eleanor and I existed in a careful orbit around each other. Polite. Distant. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final speeches. Just a shared understanding that something essential had changed. She never acknowledged the full scope of what she'd done. I never demanded that she do so. Closure, it turns out, doesn't require confession. It requires boundaries. I stopped minimizing my own discomfort to preserve hers. When she spoke over me, I reclaimed the floor. When she offered unsolicited guidance, I thanked her and declined. These moments weren't confrontational. They were factual. And each one reinforced a truth I had neglected for too long. I was allowed to decide what entered my life. There were nights I thought about my mother, about what she might have known, what she might have suspected. I realized then that part of my grief had been unfinished because part of her legacy had been obscured. Clearing that distortion felt like an act of respect, not just to myself, but to her. One afternoon, months later, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on other people behaving well, but the solid kind that comes from clarity. From knowing where you stand and what you will no longer tolerate. Eleanor's presence in my life became contextual instead of central. She was no longer the axis around which decisions turned. And without that role, she seemed smaller, not diminished, but human. Limited. Fallible. That was its own kind of release. I didn't rebuild trust with her. I rebuilt it with myself. And in doing so, I learned something that no statement, no ledger, no confrontation could have taught me alone. Healing isn't about undoing the past. It's about refusing to let it author your future. There's a quiet lie we're taught as we age, that keeping the peace is the same thing as being kind. It isn't. Peace without truth is just silence wearing good manners. For a long time, I believed that trusting family meant stepping back, letting stronger voices lead, assuming good intentions would naturally produce good outcomes. I mistook familiarity for safety. I mistook confidence for competence. And I mistook my own calm nature for a lack of authority. What this experience taught me is simpler, and far more enduring. Trust is not the absence of questions. It is the presence of transparency. Eleanor didn't ruin our family by redirecting accounts or concealing information. Those were symptoms. What caused the real damage was the assumption that she had the right to decide what I should know, what I could handle, and what was better left alone. Control justified by affection is still control. And silence, no matter how polite, is still permission. The truth didn't explode our lives when it came out. It clarified them. It returned responsibility to the people it belonged to. It replaced inherited roles with chosen ones. And it reminded everyone involved that age does not diminish agency. It sharpens it, if you let it. I didn't win anything in the dramatic sense. There was no apology that healed all wounds, no reunion that restored an old closeness. What I gained was something quieter and far more valuable. Alignment. My life now reflects my values, not someone else's version of what those values should be. My decisions are informed, not deferred. My peace is earned, not borrowed. If there's a lesson here worth carrying forward, it's this. When something feels settled too quickly, look closer. When someone insists you don't need to know, ask why. And when the truth finally finds its way to you, no matter how late, don't rush to soften it for the comfort of others. Let it stand. Because the truth doesn't demand revenge. It demands recognition. And once you give it that, it has a way of setting everything else exactly where it belongs.